A poor black restaurant owner can barely keep her doors open, but every single night she sets aside a full plate, pork chop, collard greens, cornbread, sweet tea, and carries it across the street to an old homeless man on a bench. She's been doing this for 7 months. She doesn't know his name, she doesn't know his story, and she has no idea that the man she's been feeding owns a $2 billion company. He walked away from everything after losing the love of his life, searching for one thing he couldn't buy. She's down to $38 in the bank, about to lose everything she's built, and she still brings him that plate. Before we begin, if someone's kindness ever changed your life, drop that story in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let me tell you what happened. The register read $67.40, and May Lorraine Johnson stared at it the way a person stares at a wound they already know won't heal on its own. She counted the bills twice, small ones mostly, a few quarters someone had left for a tip. She pressed them flat against the counter and set them beside the eviction notice, still taped to the inside of the front door where Gerald Covey had stuck it 4 days ago, the adhesive pulling at the paint. 30 days, $4,200. Numbers that lived in her chest now, heavier than anything she could cook or clean or pray away. The restaurant was quiet at this hour. Tuesday nights always emptied early. She moved through the dining room the way she always did after close, slowly, touching things, running a cloth across the cracked vinyl of the corner booth, the one that wobbled if you leaned too far right, straightening the handwritten specials board above the counter, pausing, as she always paused, at the framed photograph of Robert, smiling in his good blue shirt, the one he wore on their anniversary every year until he didn't anymore. "We're still here, baby," she said to the photo. She didn't wait for an answer. She knew how silence talked. In the kitchen, she wrapped the last of the collard greens, covered the cornbread with foil, and ladled a thick pour of smothered pork chop gravy over a full plate. She did this before she counted the till. She always did this before she counted the till. 7 months, and not once had she set the plate aside after. Only before, so there was never any question of whether she could afford it. The night was cold for October. She pulled her coat tight and crossed Piedmont Avenue, plate balanced in both hands, steam rising off the sweet tea. The bench near the bus stop sat under a dying street light, and Earl was there the way he was always there, settled into himself, quiet as furniture, hands folded across his knees. He looked up when he heard her steps. "There she is," he said softly. "Here I am." May set the plate on the bench beside him and stayed standing, watching him bow his head for a brief, private moment before he picked up the fork. That was one of the things she'd noticed about Earl. He always said grace, even when it was just the two of them and nobody was watching. "How'd Bria do on that algebra test?" he asked. 84. "That's a fine grade." "She thinks it isn't." Earl smiled at his plate. "Smart girl." "Too smart." May pulled her coat tighter. "That cough sounds worse." "I'm fine." "You've been fine for 3 months. At some point, fine becomes a lie, Earl." He looked at her then, those deep, still eyes that always seemed to be listening for something underneath whatever was being said. "You know," he said, "most people walk past me like I'm furniture. You walk toward me like I'm family." May was quiet for a moment. "Well," she said finally, "you are." She left him on the bench and climbed the stairs to the apartment above the restaurant, where Bria sat at the kitchen table with her homework spread wide, pencil tucked behind her ear. "Grammy, you eat?" "I ate earlier." She hadn't. Bria looked at her the way 13-year-olds look at you when they know you're lying but love you too much to say so. "Are we going to lose the restaurant?" May set her purse down, smoothed her apron, though she'd already taken it off. "We'll be fine, baby." Bria nodded slowly, went back to her homework. May went to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and did math in the dark. She'd been doing this math for months. The rent she owed, the rent coming due, the cost of the fryer belt that needed replacing, Bria's winter coat, the $67.40 in the register, and the $4,200 on the door, and the distance between those two numbers that she could not, no matter how many ways she counted, make smaller. The numbers never added up. They never added up, and May lay down in her clothes, and eventually her eyes closed, and the numbers were still there when they did. Gerald Covey arrived at 9:15 in the morning, pulling his silver BMW directly up onto the curb in front of Lorraine's table, so there was no question about whose presence commanded the sidewalk. He was in a pale yellow polo shirt, tucked tight over his belly, khakis crisp, cologne arriving a full step ahead of him when he pushed through the door. May was behind the counter. Cora Banks was in her usual booth with her reading glasses and her worn leather purse. Terrence Willis sat at the counter, nursing coffee before his first client of the morning, gold pinky ring catching the light. Two others, a city worker and a young woman May didn't know well yet, sat with their breakfasts going warm. Gerald didn't lower his voice. "I need everybody to hear this," he said, which was how May knew it was going to be bad. He always said that right before he made sure it was. He laid it out loud and deliberate. 3 months past due. The right to padlock under Section 12 of the lease. The grace period, which was nearly gone. May stood with her hands flat on the counter and listened, and the only thing that moved on her face was the slow tightening at the corner of her jaw. "This place is already a ghost, May." Gerald spread his hands like he was apologizing to a funeral. "I'm just making it official." Cora's cup set down hard in its saucer. Terrence didn't look at Gerald. He looked at his coffee, which was the same thing he always did when a situation was exactly as bad as it looked. The young woman May didn't know quietly left $4 on the table and slipped out. Gerald left the way he came. Announcements made, car still on the curb, cologne trailing. Cora crossed the room before the door had finished swinging. "May, I'm fine." May was already moving toward the kitchen. "You don't have to be fine right now." "I have biscuits in the oven." She went to her biscuits. She stood over the oven and breathed, slowly, the way Robert used to tell her. In through the nose, hold it, let it out. She had learned, over years of this life, that the kitchen was the only place where the terms were hers. Everything in the kitchen responded to effort. You put in the work, you got the result. Outside the kitchen, that math didn't hold. That evening she crossed Piedmont Avenue as usual. Earl was on his bench. He watched her come and took the plate the way he always did, both hands, careful, like he understood what it cost. She didn't mention Gerald, but Earl had been watching people his whole life, and he saw what he saw. Her hands, when she passed him the plate, had a faint tremor she was working to hide. "Talk to me," he said gently. "Nothing to talk about." "May." She looked at the street. A bus went past, nearly empty. "Just a hard day. Everybody has them." Earl nodded. He didn't push. He ate in the quiet way he always ate, and May sat beside him for a few minutes, the way she always did, and when she said goodnight and crossed back toward the restaurant, he watched her go. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his threadbare olive jacket and drew out a photograph, worn at the edges, soft from handling. A woman, caught mid-laugh, her whole face lit from somewhere inside. He looked at it for a long time. "She reminds me of you, Doris," he whispered. The apartment light above the restaurant came on. He watched it. He had spent 18 months learning that most people's goodness was a performance, something they switched on for audiences and off when the room emptied. He had watched it happen 100 times from this bench. Kindness that needed witnesses, generosity that required credit, patience that expired the moment it cost something real. May had come back every night for 7 months. Rain, cold, the nights she looked like she hadn't eaten, the nights he could tell she'd been crying before she crossed the street. She came back. The light in the apartment window stayed on for a long time. Earl sat on the bench in the October dark, and the warmth he'd carried for months began to shift into something else, something quieter and more purposeful. He had been waiting. He wasn't sure for what. He was beginning to think he knew. It was the middle of January when she first found him. Not found. That wasn't quite right. She'd seen him on the bench for 2 weeks before she did anything. Noticed him the way you notice a detail that doesn't fit. An old man, always in the same spot, always still, watching traffic like it was something worth studying. On the 15th night, she pushed through the kitchen door with a second plate and crossed the street without entirely deciding to. He'd looked up at her with those careful eyes and said nothing. "You hungry?" she asked. A long pause. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't." She held out the plate. He took it. That was all. He took it and said thank you in a voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it over the passing cars. She went back in without asking his name. The first week was awkward, him unsure what she wanted from him, her unsure why she kept coming. She'd set the plate down, exchange a few words about the weather, and go. He offered nothing. She didn't ask for anything. Slowly, like something that grew better for not being forced, the 10 minutes became comfortable. He told her his name on the third week. Earl. Just Earl. She told him hers, and he'd said, "That's a good name. Lorraine's Table. I've seen the sign." "My mother's name," May said. "I always meant to call it Maze, but it never felt right." "No," Earl said. "Lorraine's is better." In the months that followed, February's ice, March mud, the slow warm of April, he watched her. Not the way men sometimes watch women, the way a person watches something they're trying to understand. He saw her slip a folded bill into his coat pocket one evening and pretend she hadn't. He saw her sit beside him for a full hour one night in March when he couldn't hold himself together, grief moving through him like weather, and she never once asked what was wrong or what she could do. She just stayed. Now it was late October, 7 months in. Earl rose from his bench at 6:30 in the morning and walked 4 blocks to the shelter on Madison, where they let him shower on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He dressed in the same layers, walked to the public library when it opened, sat in the periodicals section and read the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, out of habit more than need. The librarian, Miss Odom, had stopped asking his name a month ago and started saving him the chair by the window. He thought about James Gaines. James, who had run Whitfield and Gaines Holdings alone for 18 months, who had called every number he could find and found nothing, who probably believed, with good reason, that Earl had finally come undone from grief and disappeared into it for good. James wasn't wrong about the grief. He was wrong about what it had produced. Earl had walked away from $2.3 billion, from a penthouse, from a board seat, from a name that opened doors in 14 states. Because when Doris died, the only question that felt worth answering was whether any of it had made the world actually better. Whether the goodness Doris believed in, quiet, stubborn, unconditional goodness, still existed outside the warmth she'd created around him. He'd come to Memphis because this was where they met. Teenagers on a summer street, her laughing at something he'd said 50 years ago. He came here to be near that. And in a year and a half of invisibility, 1,000 strangers, 100 small cruelties disguised as indifference. In all of that, there was May. He found a payphone on Union Avenue after the library, dropped in the coins, dialed a number he hadn't dialed in 18 months. James picked up on the second ring, and the silence that followed was the kind that carried everything that had happened in between. "It's me," Earl said. Another silence. Then, "Where are you?" "Memphis." "Are you—" "I'm fine, James." He looked down the street toward Piedmont Avenue, where the lights of Lorraine's Table were just beginning to glow in the early evening. Not yet, he said quietly. But soon. He didn't explain. He hung up the phone and walked back toward the bench. May's restaurant was warming up for dinner service, lights spilling gold from the windows onto the sidewalk. Earl sat down, folded his hands, and watched the door. 18 months, 1,000 strangers. She's the only one who ever came back the next night. He wasn't going to be passive much longer. Dale Fenton was already inside when May unlocked the front door. He was a wiry man in a short-sleeved dress shirt with a county badge clipped to his breast pocket and a clipboard pressed flat against his ribs like a shield. He didn't look up when she came in. He was bent over the far counter, running a finger along the underside of a shelf and examining it with the focused displeasure of a man who needed to find something. May stood in the doorway. "Can I help you?" "Memphis Health and Safety Division." He still didn't look up. "Routine inspection." Cora arrived 20 minutes later and slid into her usual booth. She watched Dale move through the dining room and leaned toward Terrence, who'd just come in behind her, and whispered 2 words that explained everything. "Gerald's cousin." Terrence set down his coffee without drinking it. Dale Fenton worked his clipboard like a weapon. He flagged the faucet handle in the prep sink. "Loose," he said. "Code violation." He measured the lower storage shelf and wrote something down with the air of a man delivering a verdict. 2 inches below regulation height. He lingered over the back wall near the mop station and pointed at a hairline gap where the baseboard had pulled away from the floor. All of it minor, all of it written in the language of catastrophe. 72 hours, he said when he was done, slapping the citation copy onto the counter. "Fix everything on that list, or I file a shutdown order." He walked out without touching the coffee May had poured him. That night, after the last customer left, May changed into her work clothes and got down on her hands and knees. She caulked the baseboard. She tightened the faucet with a wrench that used to be Robert's. She reorganized the storage shelves, measuring twice, a piece of tape marking the new height. Bria came downstairs at 10 o'clock in her pajamas, braids half undone, white sneakers still on her feet the way they always were until she went to sleep. She looked at her grandmother on the floor. She didn't say a word. She picked up a scrub brush and started on the tiles beside her. They worked like that until 2 in the morning, side by side, not talking much, just working. It was Bria who finally said it. She sat back on her heels, brush still in her hand, and looked at May. "Mama always said you were the strongest person she ever knew." She paused. I think she was right. May kept scrubbing. Her throat was too tight for words. The replacement grease trap was the problem she'd been putting off thinking about. $340. She'd priced it out twice, hoping the number would change. It didn't. She went to her jewelry box that night and opened it slowly, the way you open something you already know is going to hurt. Robert's watch sat on the velvet in the dark, gold-plated, modest, scratched on the face from a lifetime of honest use. She'd been to the pawn shop on Lamar Avenue exactly once before, 4 years ago, for Keisha's funeral costs. She still remembered the man behind the counter, how he looked at her like she was something being reduced. She went back the next morning. The man gave her $375. She bought the grease trap and stood on the sidewalk outside the pawn shop with the receipt in one hand and the other hand pressed flat to her chest, right where the watch would have rested. "I'm sorry, Robert," she whispered. "I'll get it back." She passed the reinspection by a margin so thin Dale Fenton stood in her kitchen with his clipboard and his pen and looked for 10 long seconds at a shelf that was now exactly at regulation height, and he couldn't find a reason to write anything down. He left without a word. May waited until his car pulled out of the lot. Then she set both hands on the counter and let out a breath she'd been holding for 3 days. She'd won this one. But the rent was still due. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she already knew Gerald Covey wasn't finished. February came in cold and wet and mean. May had been watching the sky all day, the way you watch something you can't stop. By evening, a hard rain had soaked Piedmont Avenue and turned it the color of old pewter, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since noon. She locked the front door, turned out the dining room lights, and crossed the street with Earl's plate. Pork chop, collards, cornbread, sweet tea, everything still warm under the foil. Earl was on the bench. He was always on the bench. But tonight, his thin jacket was soaked through, and his shoulders were up around his ears, and she could hear his teeth from 10 feet away. Earl, she set the plate down. You are not staying out here tonight. I'm all right. You are not all right. She set down the plate, unwound her coat from her shoulders, and wrapped it around him before he could say another word. Heavy wool, dark green, the one she'd bought at a church sale 3 winters ago. He tried to push it back. May, don't. She sat down beside him. Just eat. He looked at her in the cold lamplight. Her arms were crossed over her sweater, and she was trying not to shiver. He started to say something. She shook her head once and nodded at the plate. He ate. She walked home in just the sweater, arms pulled tight across her chest, and didn't look back. The next day at the restaurant, Bria came in from school and dropped her backpack on the corner chair. As it tipped over, a folded permission slip slid out and landed face up on the floor. May picked it up before Bria could. Washington, D.C., 3 days. Educational enrichment trip. Cost to families, $1,600. Bria was watching her with the practiced stillness of a child who has learned to hide want. Her jaw was set exactly the way May's jaw set when May was trying not to need something. Grammy, it's okay. I don't need to go. Did you want to go? May asked. A pause, then, barely. Yeah. Then you're going. May folded the permission slip neatly and put it in her apron pocket. Your mama never got to see the world. You're going to see it for both of you. Bria pressed her lips together and nodded quickly, and picked up her backpack and went to do her homework. And May watched her go, and did not let herself think about the numbers yet. She started cutting her own meals the next morning. 1 plate a day. Whatever was left after Bria and the customers had eaten. She picked up a weekend cleaning job at a Baptist church on Summer Avenue. $12 an hour, 3 hours Saturday, 3 hours Sunday. She came home those evenings with her knees aching and went straight back to the restaurant books and kept counting. Earl noticed. Of course he noticed. One evening he looked at her across the bench and said, You eating enough? I'm fine. You've gotten thinner. I've always been thin. May. She changed the subject to Bria's social studies project, and he let her, but his eyes didn't let her go the way she wanted them to. He watched her cross back to the restaurant that night and stayed on the bench long after the lights went on above the restaurant, running one hand slowly over the collar of the coat she'd given him. It still held the faint smell of her kitchen, seasoning and dish soap, and something underneath that he couldn't name, something that reminded him of every decent thing he'd ever believed about people before the world taught him to stop believing it. Doris would have loved her, he thought. He sat with that thought for a long time, and when the apartment light went off above the restaurant, he was still sitting there, watching, thinking, calculating the particular weight of a kindness that costs everything and asks for nothing. He wasn't going to wait much longer. Earl walked to the payphone on Union Avenue at 8 in the morning, before the street filled up. He dropped in his coins the way he'd done it twice before, dialed the Atlanta number from memory, and waited. James Gaines picked up on the second ring. The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. Earl counted them. You're alive, James said finally. His voice was steady, but only barely. I'm alive. Earl. A long exhale. I thought you were dead. I thought... It doesn't matter what I thought. A pause. Where are you? Memphis. Come home. Not yet. Earl watched a bus roll past, nearly empty, heading toward the river. I need something, James. Of course you do. There's a woman here, May Lorraine Johnson. She runs a soul food restaurant on Piedmont Avenue, Lorraine's Table. I need a quiet background check, not invasive. Employment history, family situation, anything that's already public record. Silence on the other end. You're asking me to investigate a woman from a payphone in Memphis. Yes. Earl, you've been missing for 18 months. James. Another silence. Then, fine. 2 days later, the same payphone. James called back, and Earl could hear the shift in his voice before a single word of the report came out. The measured tone of a man who had looked at something and found himself unprepared for it. May Johnson, born 1971. Licensed practical nurse scholarship deferred at age 26 to care for her mother, who died 8 months later. The scholarship expired and she never reapplied. Married Robert Johnson in 1995. Used his life insurance after his death to open Lorraine's Table. Her daughter Keisha died of an overdose 4 years ago. She took custody of her 13-year-old granddaughter Bria the same week, without any legal delay. No criminal record, no outstanding debts apart from the restaurant lease. Nothing hidden, nothing complicated. Just a life spent choosing other people first, every single time. James was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then, Earl, this woman gave you her coat in February. I'm looking at her bank statements, and she had $38 to her name. He paused. What kind of person does that? The kind I've been looking for, Earl said. He meant it the way a man means something after 18 months of looking. That evening, May brought his plate at the usual hour. She was moving carefully. Her right knee had been bothering her. He could tell from the slight drag in her step she was working to hide. She sat down with a small sigh and asked about his cough, the way she always did. He asked about her life before the restaurant. He'd never asked directly. She looked at him sideways, the way she looked at questions she wasn't sure about, and then she said, I almost became a nurse. Long time ago. What happened? Mama got sick. She said it simply, without grief or performance, just fact. I was needed somewhere. Earl nodded slowly. I was in business, he offered. Lost someone. Didn't see the point anymore. She looked at him for a moment. I understand loss, she said quietly. That was all. They sat in the cold and didn't say anything else for a while, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that only builds between people who have been honest with each other, even when the honesty is incomplete. May went back inside, and Earl reached into his coat pocket, her coat, and drew out Doris's photograph. He looked at it for a long time. Then he put it away, sat very still, and made the kind of decision that doesn't announce itself, the quiet kind. The kind that has already been made for weeks and only now gets acknowledged. It was time. May counted the cash on Tuesday night, with the kitchen lights still on and the front door locked, spreading the bills flat against the prep table the way a card player spreads a hand they're not sure about. $1,240. 360 short. She'd been saving since February, dollar by dollar, shift by shift, the church cleaning money, the extra hours, the meals she skipped and told herself she wasn't hungry. She told Bria it was handled. It wasn't handled yet. She picked up the next weekend shift at the church. She asked Cora and Terrence if anyone in the neighborhood needed help. Cleaning, cooking, whatever. Terrence found her a Friday evening job, setting up folding chairs for a banquet hall on Airways Boulevard. $20 cash. She took it. By Thursday, she was running on 4 hours of sleep, and her feet ached from the floor up. That night, when she crossed Piedmont Avenue with Earl's plate, she caught her toe on a crack in the asphalt and stumbled forward. Earl was on his feet before she could right herself, one hand steadying her elbow, the plate still somehow level in her other hand. "Easy," he said quietly. "I'm fine." She straightened. "Just tired." They sat together. The night was still cold but dry. Earl ate slowly, the way he always did, and May sat with her hands folded, looking at the street, and after a while her wallet slipped sideways out of her coat pocket and fell open on the bench between them. Earl glanced down before he could stop himself. A thin fold of worn bills. Not much. After May went inside, he checked the coat pocket she'd given him, the deep left one she always patted when she thought he wasn't watching. There it was, a folded 20 pressed flat. He unfolded it and held it under the streetlight. She had, by his count, left herself almost nothing. He sat with that for a long time. Friday morning, May opened the register and counted again. $1,600 exactly. She drove to the school before first bell and paid the trip balance in person. The secretary handed her a receipt, and May folded it into her wallet next to the $38 that remained. That night, she sat alone in the dark restaurant, lights off, register empty. She didn't cry. She just sat very still, with her hands on her knees and her eyes open, and the silence in the room was the kind that has weight to it. The silence of a life held together by will when everything else has run out. "Robert," she whispered, "I hope you can see her. She's going to be everything we dreamed." Saturday morning, Bria came downstairs in her school clothes and her white sneakers, freshly scrubbed, her 2 braids neat, her eyes bright in a way May hadn't seen in months. The bus came at 7:15. May stood on the sidewalk and waved until it turned the corner and disappeared, and then she went back inside Lorraine's table and served the lunch rush alone on $38 and everything she had left. That evening, she carried Earl's plate across the street. She was thinner than she'd been in October. She was tired in a way that had settled into her bones. But she was smiling, quietly, because Bria was on that bus, and that was the only math that mattered. Earl watched her come, and he knew exactly what the smile was costing her. He didn't say anything, but something had changed behind his eyes, something that had finished waiting. Monday came gray and cold, and Gerald Covey's BMW was at the curb by 9. May saw it from the apartment window. Her stomach dropped before she'd even pulled on her shoes. He had a locksmith with him. A sheriff's deputy stood by the door in a county-issued jacket, hands at his sides, face professionally blank. The face of a man doing a job he'd done 100 times and stopped thinking about. Gerald didn't bother with small talk. 30 days are up, May. I have until Friday. Her voice was level. Her hands were not. Section 14B, Accelerated Forfeiture Clause. He held up a copy of the lease she'd signed 4 years ago, the fine print she'd read once and then trusted. Filed 10 days ago. You weren't notified because the clause doesn't require it. He almost smiled. It's all in the contract. The locksmith was already at the door. May stood on the sidewalk and watched him change the locks. That was all she could do. Stand and watch. The deputy was there to make sure she understood that. Cora arrived for her lunch shift and stopped on the sidewalk, reading glasses on her nose, leather purse clutched tight. Terrence came 2 minutes behind her. They stood beside May, and nobody said anything, because there was nothing that words could do about a locksmith and a signed contract and a deputy standing there making it official. Gerald walked past them toward his car. He paused. Shoulda quit a year ago, May. Some people just aren't meant to make it. He said it loud enough for the neighboring storefronts to hear. That was the point. He got in the BMW and drove away. May sat down on the curb. Not dramatically. Not with any performance of grief. She just sat down, slowly, on the edge of the concrete and looked at the darkened windows of her restaurant. Robert's life insurance money. Her mother's name on the sign. 12 years of early mornings and late nights. all of it behind a lock that wasn't hers anymore. And for the first time in this story, she cried. Quietly, hands folded, tears running down her face the way rain runs down glass, steady and silent and without apology. Cora sat down beside her on the curb. She didn't speak. She didn't try to fix it. She just sat there, close enough to matter, and that was the only mercy available. That evening, May made Earl's plate in her apartment kitchen upstairs and carried it down the back stairs and across the street. Earl saw the padlock on the door from half a block away. He saw May's face when she reached the bench. He took the plate with both hands and looked at her for a moment. "Thank you, May," he said, "same as every night." She nodded and sat with him for a while. She didn't tell him what happened. She didn't need to. He already knew. After she went upstairs, Earl stood up from the bench. He looked at the padlocked door of Lorraine's table for a long time. The darkened windows, the sign with her mother's name. Then he turned. And he walked. Not toward the shelter, not toward the library, but toward downtown Memphis, moving with a purpose and a pace that didn't belong to the man who had been sitting on that bench for 7 months. The decision had already been made. Now it was time to act on it. Earl called James at 6 in the morning from the hotel lobby payphone. He'd checked in the night before. A clean, modest place on Madison, cash paid at the desk. James answered on the first ring. He'd been waiting. "I need you in Memphis by Thursday," Earl said. "Bring the attorneys." A pause, then, "Tell me what we're doing," Earl told him. He showered for the first time in months in a real bathroom and stood in front of the mirror and looked at the man who'd been living on a bench for 7 months. Older, thinner, silver stubble grown long, and felt, underneath it all, something he hadn't felt since Doris died. Ready. He called a tailor on Union Avenue who owed him a favor from a decade back, and the man remembered, and he came that afternoon with 2 suits in Earl's size and did the alterations in less than 24 hours. Meanwhile, James's legal team in Atlanta was working the phones. They found what Earl already suspected. The strip mall on Piedmont Avenue was held by a small regional lender, and the primary owner, the one whose name was buried 3 layers deep in the property records, was leveraged past his limit on 2 other Memphis properties. Desperate money, the kind that moves when a better number arrives. James made the call Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the deal was done. $1.4 million, cash, wire transfer. The strip mall's mortgage note changed hands quietly, the way real money always moves, without drama, without announcement, and with complete finality. Earl also asked James for one more thing. He asked him to compile a list, a specific one. Every act of kindness James could document, from the details Earl had told him, dates, specifics, the things Earl had recorded in his memory, the way a man records what matters. The coat, February 14th, ice on the ground, May walking home in a sweater. The $20 bill, found in the pocket, estimated $38 remaining in her wallet. The night in March, when Earl had broken down on the bench, overwhelmed by a grief he couldn't speak, and May had sat beside him for a full hour, never asking why, never asking what she could get in return. James read the list back to Earl over the phone when it was done. He went quiet for a moment afterward. Then he said, "Earl, she gave you $20 when she had 38. I manage a $2 billion fund, and I'm not sure I've ever seen generosity like that." Earl didn't answer right away. He was looking out the hotel window at the Memphis skyline, gray and modest and familiar, the city where he and Doris had started everything. "No," he said finally. "Neither have I." Thursday morning, Earl dressed in the charcoal suit. He stood before the mirror and straightened his collar, and for the first time in 18 months, saw the man Doris had married looking back at him. Not unchanged, not unwounded, but present, here, ready to do what needed doing. James arrived at 10 with two attorneys in a black Lincoln Town car. They drove toward Piedmont Avenue. Gerald Covey had no idea what was coming. Neither, for that matter, did May. But everything was about to change. And this time, it was going to change in her favor. Thursday came in clear and cold, and May was at the strip mall by 10 with Cora's car pulled up to the curb and two cardboard boxes on the sidewalk. Gerald had told her she could collect her personal belongings by appointment. She'd made the appointment for 10 o'clock. She was going to be in and out in 20 minutes, take what was hers, and not give him the satisfaction of seeing her face any longer than necessary. But Gerald was already there. Silver BMW at the curb, polo shirt, pleated khakis, cologne you could smell from the parking lot. He had a small audience. Cora and Terrence had come without being asked, and two neighboring business owners stood near their storefronts, watching with the quiet attention of people who understood that what was happening here could happen to any of them. Gerald saw his audience and straightened up. "Used pots," he announced, as May's boxes came out. He was narrating her things like an auctioneer at an estate sale, each word calibrated for the sidewalk. Old pictures, a busted cash register. He shook his head with theatrical sadness. 12 years and this is what's left. You hate to see it. May loaded the boxes into Cora's trunk. Her jaw was set. Her hands were steady. She didn't look at him. "I always said this block needed upgrading," Gerald continued. "No offense, May, but some businesses just run their course. New chapter for everyone." Terrence's hands had balled into fists at his sides. Cora's leather purse was cinched so tight her knuckles had gone pale. But there was nothing either of them could do. They all knew it. That was the particular cruelty of this moment, the helplessness of people who loved someone and could only stand there and watch. Then a black Lincoln Town car rolled slowly into the lot and stopped. The front passenger door opened. A trim man in a charcoal suit stepped out. No tie, platinum watch catching the morning light. Then the rear door opened and an attorney followed, briefcase in hand. Then the other rear door opened. An Earl stepped out. Not the Earl from the bench. Not the Earl in the olive jacket and layered mismatched clothes. This was a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit, silver white stubble neat against his jaw, shoulders straight, walking with a cane and the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once in his life needed to announce himself. May went completely still. She recognized his face. She recognized his eyes, those deep, watching eyes she'd looked into across a bench for 7 months. But nothing else fit. Nothing else made sense. The suit, the car, the attorney. Her mind couldn't arrange it into anything coherent. "Earl?" she breathed. He looked at her, and something in his expression, steady, warm, certain, settled the question before the words came. "It's me, May," he said quietly. "Same man, same bench, just a different coat." Gerald, who had not recognized Earl, and who saw only 3 well-dressed men and a business opportunity, stepped forward with a broad smile and his hand extended. "Gentlemen, you hear about the vacancy? Because I can tell you, the foot traffic on this block..." Earl turned to look at him. "I know about the vacancy," he said. His voice was calm, completely calm. "I know exactly how it happened." Gerald's smile faltered. Earl turned to his attorney and gave one small nod. It was time to begin. The attorney opened his briefcase on the hood of the Lincoln Town car, and the sidewalk went quiet in the way that sidewalks go quiet when everyone present understands that something permanent is happening. "Mr. Covey," the attorney said, "Whitfield and Gaines Holdings completed the purchase of the mortgage note on this strip mall yesterday morning. $1.4 million, cash, wire transfer, fully recorded." He produced a document and held it out. "Mr. Earl Whitfield is now the note holder of record. As of this morning, he is effectively your landlord." Gerald stared at the paper. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The attorney produced a second document. This is a termination letter for your property management contract, effective immediately. The grounds include the accelerated forfeiture clause you filed against Miss Johnson, which, as it turns out, violates the terms of your own management agreement with the property's prior note holder. Your contract required 30 days written notice to tenants in all non-emergency situations. You filed an accelerated claim without notification. He paused. In short, the same clause you used against her ended your contract. Gerald's face had gone the color of old ash. The BMW at the curb, once an announcement, now looked like a mistake he'd made without knowing it. Earl let the silence hold for a moment. Then he turned to May. She was shaking, not from fear, from something that had no name yet, something between shock and disbelief and a dawning, terrifying hope that she was afraid to trust. May, Earl said. He spoke to her the way he had always spoken to her, quietly, without performance, every word deliberate. I want to tell you what I saw. And he did. He told the sidewalk, the crowd that had gathered now, neighbors pressing in from both directions, exactly what 7 months looked like from a bench on Piedmont Avenue. The first plate on a January night, the February ice storm when she'd walked home in a sweater, arms crossed against the cold, because she'd given him her coat without a second thought. The evening in March when grief had broken through him like water through a dam, and she had sat beside him for a full hour without asking a single question, without needing anything in return, just present, just there. She slipped $20 into my coat pocket, he said. The same week she had $38 to her name. He paused. I know because I counted what she had left. Cora pressed her hand over her mouth. Terrence looked away, jaw working. She fed me every single night for 7 months, Earl continued. Not once did she know who I was. Not once did she ask what I could give her. She just knew I was hungry. He looked at May directly. You fed me when you were starving. That's not charity. That's character. May's eyes were bright with tears she wasn't letting fall. Her chin was up. Earl told her the restaurant was hers, rent-free, permanently, with a full renovation fund waiting. That was when the tears came. Quietly, the way May did everything, not with a sound, just streaming down her face while she stood straight and dignified and held her own hands to keep them still. Cora was crying openly. Terrence turned back, and his eyes were wet. Gerald found his voice. You can't just... The attorney was already holding out a third document. Formal complaint filed with the Memphis-Shelby County Health Department regarding Inspector Dale Fenton's conduct during the October inspection of this premises. Mr. Covey is named as a co-conspirator. The County Board of Health has been notified. Gerald took the paper. He read it. He read it again. He had no move left. There was no audience left to perform for. The crowd around him had shifted, quietly and completely, in a direction he could not follow. He walked to his BMW. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved to stop him. The crowd parted around him the way water parts around something that has already sunk. He got in. He drove away. And May stood in front of her restaurant, keys in her hand, Earl beside her, and looked up at the sign with her mother's name on it, and breathed. 2 weeks later, Lorraine's table smelled like fresh paint and sawdust and the particular promise of a thing being made right. Contractors moved through the dining room with purpose. New booth cushions, deep red, replaced the cracked vinyl. The kitchen was being outfitted with a commercial hood vent and a 6-burner range that actually worked. The handwritten specials board had been carefully removed from the wall, cleaned, and set aside to be rehung in the exact same spot. May oversaw all of it with her apron on and a clipboard she didn't entirely know how to use, pointing at things and asking questions, still slightly dazed, the way a person moves through a dream they aren't sure they're awake in yet. Bria came home from Washington on a Tuesday afternoon full of everything. The Lincoln Memorial, the bus ride, the girl from her class she'd made friends with, the cherry blossom she hadn't expected. She came through the door of the apartment with her backpack on and her white sneakers dusty from travel and her face wide open in a way May hadn't seen since before the eviction notice went up. May sat her down at the kitchen table and told her everything. Bria listened without interrupting, which was not like her, and when May finished, she sat very still for a moment. "The man from the bench," she said. "Earl." "Yes." Bria nodded slowly, the way she nodded when something confirmed what she'd already suspected. "I always thought he was different." Earl came by the restaurant that afternoon, as he had every day since Thursday. He walked through the renovation at May's invitation, stopping to look at things, nodding, asking questions about what she wanted. He'd moved into a modest apartment on Cooper Street, 3 blocks away. He had a phone now and clean clothes, and he still moved with the same unhurried steadiness he'd had on the bench. That hadn't changed. When Bria saw him, she walked across the half-finished dining room and hugged him, just like that. Arms around his middle, cheek against his chest, the way children hug people they've already decided to trust. Earl went completely still. His hands came up slowly and rested on her shoulders. His eyes closed for a moment, and something moved across his face that was too deep for a stranger to read. But May saw it, and she understood it. He had no grandchildren. He had never had children. He and Doris had wanted them a long time ago, and life had gone a different direction. And now here was this girl, unguarded and warm and completely sure of him, and it undid something in him that had been wound very tight for a very long time. Later, Earl and James Gaines sat across from May in the freshly painted dining room, the contractor noise a backdrop to everything, and laid out the plan in full. The Doris Whitfield Community Kitchen Fund, $5 million in endowment. Lorraine's Table as the flagship location. May as program director, salaried, with full creative control over the curriculum and the menu. A workforce training program for formerly homeless men and women. Skills, certifications, job placement. Designed to be replicated. Memphis first, then Birmingham, then as far as the model could reach. May listened with her hands flat on the table. When Earl finished, she looked at him for a long time. "I didn't do any of that for a reward," she said. Earl met her eyes. "I know," he said. "That's exactly why you're getting one." She was quiet for another moment. Then she nodded once, the way May nodded when something was decided and there was no more need for words. She stood up, crossed the dining room, and pinned a new sign to the front door. Grand reopening, Saturday. It was the first time in 2 weeks that Lorraine's Table had anything posted on that door except a padlock. She stood back and looked at it, and for the first time in a very long time, the math in her head added up. Lorraine's Table on a Saturday night looked like a different place and exactly the same place all at once. The booths were new, but the layout hadn't moved. The kitchen gleamed with equipment that actually worked, but the handwritten specials board hung in its same spot on the wall, May's handwriting unchanged. Robert's photograph was still behind the counter, and beside it now, in a matching frame, a woman mid-laugh, her whole face lit from somewhere inside. Doris Whitfield, who had never set foot in this restaurant, but whose name was on the fund that brought it back to life. The dining room was packed. Every booth, every chair. Cora Banks sat in the front row in her good Sunday blouse, reading glasses on, leather purse in her lap. Terrence Willis was beside her, gold pinky ring catching the light, shoulders straight in a way that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with relief. James Gaines sat near the back, charcoal suit, platinum watch, looking at the room with the quiet expression of a man being reminded of something he'd forgotten mattered. Earl was in his corner booth, his booth now, by common agreement. May stood at the front of the room with her apron on because she'd forgotten to take it off and then decided not to. She thanked her regulars first, the ones who had come every day even when the menu shrank and the booths wobbled, and the future looked like it was closing in. She said Robert's name. She said Keisha's name. Her voice held on both. She introduced the Doris Whitfield Community Kitchen Fund, and then she introduced 4 people standing near the kitchen door, 2 men and 2 women, formerly homeless, now in clean aprons, 3 weeks into their training, looking out at the crowd with the careful, cautious hope of people who were still learning to trust good things. The room applauded. Long and warm. Across town, in a property management office that smelled of old coffee and drugstore cologne, Gerald Covey's phone rang. He answered it. He listened. The County Licensing Board. Pending investigation. Property management certification revoked, effective immediately, pending review of the Fenton inspection scheme. He was named as a co-conspirator in the formal complaint. He set the phone down on his desk. He sat back in his chair, and he stared at the wall of his empty office. No audience, no BMW announcement, no performance left to give. And for the first time in his life, the room reflected exactly who he was. Small, quiet, finished. Back at Lorraine's table, Bria stood up. She had a folded piece of paper in her hand, slightly crumpled at the corner from being held too tight. She smoothed it once against her leg, looked up at the room, all these adults, all this warmth, all these eyes on her, and began to read in the clear, unhurried voice of a girl who had her grandmother's steadiness and her mother's smile, and something that was entirely her own. My grandmother taught me that kindness isn't what you do when people are watching, she read. It's what you do when you think nobody ever will. The room went still. She fed a stranger every night for 7 months. She gave away her coat in the cold. She worked 3 jobs and didn't tell anyone. She never once asked for anything back. Bria looked up from the paper. Her eyes found May's across the room. I watched her do all of it, and I want to be like that when I grow up. I want to be exactly like that. Tears streamed down Cora's face. Terrence pressed his fingers to his eyes. James Gaines looked down at the table for a moment, and when he looked back up, something in his expression had been rearranged by what he'd just heard. Earl wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He didn't try to hide it. When the room found its breath again, Earl stood, slowly with his cane, and announced one final thing. A full educational trust for Bria Johnson. Tuition, books, housing, and living expenses from high school through college and beyond. Fully funded, irrevocable. May reached across the table and took Earl's hand. She held it. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Some things don't require words. They just require presence, and May had always understood that better than anyone. The music started. The plates went out. The dining room filled with the smell of smothered pork chop and collard greens and cornbread still warm from the oven, and the sound of a community gathered around a table that almost wasn't there anymore. Lorraine's table was open, and this time it wasn't going anywhere. 6 months later, Lorraine's table had a 2-hour wait on Friday nights. 12 graduates of the Doris Whitfield Community Kitchen Fund were employed across Memphis, in hotel kitchens, catering operations, a breakfast spot on Union Avenue where one of them had just been promoted to line lead. The fund had broken ground on a second location in Birmingham, Alabama. A reporter from a Nashville newspaper had come to write about the program and ended up staying for dinner twice. May walked through the restaurant at closing time on a Friday, moving the way she'd always moved, slowly, touching things. The register was full. The booths were solid under her hands. Robert's photograph hung behind the counter in its same spot, and Doris's photograph hung beside it, and May said goodnight to both of them the way she always did before she turned out the lights. Bria was at the prep table near the kitchen door, talking a young trainee through the right way to hold a chef's knife. Not lecturing, just showing, the way May had always taught. Patient, unhurried. 14 years old and already her grandmother's daughter in every way that mattered. Earl sat in his corner booth with a cup of tea going cold because he'd been talking too long to notice. He'd moved into the Cooper Street apartment 6 months ago, and he hadn't gone back to Atlanta. He volunteered at the kitchen program 3 days a week. He ate dinner at Lorraine's table most evenings. He was not a guest anymore. He was something that didn't have a clean word for it. Somewhere between regular and family, which was, May had decided, the best category a person could occupy. She stopped at his booth on her way to the kitchen. "Heading out," she said. He nodded. "Go on then." She went to the kitchen and plated the last of the evening's food: smothered pork chop, collard greens, cornbread, sweet tea. She covered it with foil and lifted it with both hands, the weight of it familiar as breathing. She turned off the kitchen lights and walked out the front door. The night was mild. Spring, finally. The air soft and carrying something that smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. Lorraine's table glowed warm behind her as she crossed Piedmont Avenue. The same street, the same walk, the same plate balanced in her hands. The bench was there, and there was someone on it. A young woman, mid-20s, thin in the way that meant something, tired in the way that meant more. She was sitting with her eyes down and her arms pulled tight across herself, the posture of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. May sat down beside her. The woman looked up, startled, suspicious the way people get when kindness arrives from an unexpected direction and they can't yet see what it wants. May held out the plate. "You hungry, sweetheart?" The woman stared at her, then at the plate, then back at May's face, the deep-set brown eyes that carried tiredness but not defeat, the hands roughened from decades of honest work, the expression that asked for nothing and offered everything. "I don't need to know your name," May said gently. "I just need to know you're hungry." The woman's eyes filled. She took the plate with both hands. May sat with her in the mild spring night, the restaurant glowing across the street, and didn't say another word. Because sometimes presence is the whole thing. Sometimes just staying is the entire act of love. Every act of quiet kindness is a seed planted in darkness. You plant it not knowing if it will grow. You plant it not knowing who is watching or what they carry or what your small, ordinary gesture might one day become in the hands of the world. May had planted hers one cold January night with a plate of food and no expectation of return, and it had grown into something she could never have imagined. A restaurant restored, a community fed, a granddaughter secured, a grieving man given back his reason to live. She hadn't done it for any of that. She'd done it because a man was hungry and she had food, and that was the whole of her reasoning, and that simplicity was the most extraordinary thing about her. The kindness continues. It always does, when someone decides to carry it forward. If this story reminded you that goodness is never wasted, that the plate you carry across the street might matter more than you'll ever know, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. And subscribe so you never miss a story.